Welcome to the debate. Usually when we look at an assembly line, there is this expectation of structural logic. If a part is defective, a worker pulls a red cord. The belt stops.
And they fix the issue.
Exactly. The floor manager thanks them for saving the batch. But step into the modern clinical environment of the National Health Service, and suddenly that red cord is wired to a trapdoor under the worker's feet. Pull it to report a defect, and you are the one who gets discarded.
I mean, the system is supposed to isolate the error before it reaches the public. That is the entire point of a regulatory framework. But as we'll see, the execution of that framework can sometimes feel incredibly detached from the reality on the wards.
Detached is, frankly, an understatement. If you are a medical student listening to this right now, preparing to enter the UK clinical workforce, you're about to step into a profound ethical dilemma. You have this strict mandate to whistleblow on unsafe practices.
Right, it's not optional.
Exactly. But what happens when the institution itself retaliates against you for doing so? Today, we are exploring that exact tension, grounded in the deeply troubling, documented ordeal of Dr. Srivatsa.
Yeah, it's a very heavy case.
It really is. He was an experienced critical care doctor whose career was effectively destroyed after he raised safety alarms about clinical errors in the NHS. So we're looking at his case juxtaposed against the General Medical Council's Good Medical Practice Guidelines. And my position today is that current healthcare regulatory processes inherently prioritize institutional protection and financial efficiency over individual physician rights and patient safety. They actively turn whistleblowing into a professional death sentence.
I hear you, but we really have to look at the flip side of this. The system isn't designed to be cruel, It is designed to cast a massive safety net. So I represent the contrasting view that, while specific cases like Dr. Srivatsa's represent tragic, devastating administrative failures, the overarching regulatory framework, including external investigations, layperson oversight, and standard clinical protocols, is fundamentally designed to ensure objective public safety.
Even when it crushes the individual doctor?
Well, it's built to prevent insular, biased medical practices where doctors just, protect other doctors. The system is flawed, certainly, but its structural design is a necessary defense against a far worse alternative.
Okay, well, let's actually look at how that so-called safety net functioned in reality, because I argue that internal whistleblowing policies offer absolutely no meaningful protection against management retaliation. Dr. Srivatsa's ordeal is the perfect, tragic distillation of this.
Okay, let's get into the specifics.
So in 2006, he was working for a Surrey Primary Care Trust, or PCT. For those unfamiliar, a PCT is basically the local administrative body that holds the purse strings for clinics in that area. He raised valid alarms about a PMS practice, which is a personal medical services clinic managed entirely by nurses.
Right, and the goal of those PMS clinics is to handle high patient volumes efficiently.
Efficiently, sure. It's an economic model. But Dr. Srivatsa documented that untrained staff there were practicing what he called cookbook medicine.
Right, strictly following flowcharts.
Exactly. Following flowcharts without the actual pharmacological knowledge backing it up. This led to severe errors, like dangerously stopping a recommended inhaler for a baby under 1 year old.
Wow.
Yeah. So he raises these concerns confidentially. And what does the PCT do? They breach his confidentiality. They informed the very nurse consultant line manager he was warning them about, which triggered a coordinated retaliatory strike.
Which is undeniably awful.
It's defensive bureaucracy, the staff fabricated complaints to distract from their own clinical errors, and the institution aggressively pursued those false complaints to protect their cheaper, nurse-led economic model. The institution mitigates risk by eliminating the person raising the alarm, rather than fixing the complex, expensive problem.
I want to pause here because what they did to him with those false accusations is genuinely sickening. I am not defending the local management's actions, but we have to separate the malicious actions of a few local administrators from the actual laws governing the General Medical Council.
But can we separate them when the laws enable the administrators?
Well, look at paragraph 75 of the Good Medical Practice Guidelines. It states that reporting colleagues who compromise patient safety is an absolute duty. However, when an institution receives a formal complaint against the doctor, any doctor, they are legally and ethically obligated to investigate it.
Even when it's obvious retaliation?
Unfortunately, yes. Regulators cannot arbitrarily dismiss formal complaints of clinical or behavioral misconduct just because the accused doctor recently filed a complaint of their own. I mean, if we throw out the necessity of formal investigations because local administrators failed, we leave patients completely unprotected.
But you can't separate the local administration from the system when the system empowers them to behave this way. And that reliance on the flowchart over the physician is exactly what creates a vulnerability when things go wrong. Which brings us to a massive point of friction here, right? What happens when a doctor relies on deep clinical experience and the institution relies on non-doctors holding pre-printed algorithms?
You're talking about the cookbook medicine aspect.
Yes! Dr. Srivatsa had 40 years of critical care experience. He was watching nurses mismanage care based entirely on decision trees.
I have to push back on that framing, though. What you pejoratively call cookbook medicine is in reality standardized care.
Standardized to a fault, I'd say.
Well, standardized protocols and the use of allied health professionals are vital safety nets. They are designed to eliminate variance and prevent rogue decision-making by individual practitioners. I mean, think about aviation. We want operators following strict checklists. If warning light A flashes, run checklist B.
But medicine is in aviation.
It scales healthcare, though. It removes the danger of a doctor simply guessing or practicing outdated medicine. And frankly, it allows walk-in clinics to serve thousands of patients who otherwise wouldn't see anyone at all. It is mathematically safer for the population as a whole.
In aviation, a Boeing 737 is identical to every other 737. If a warning light flashes, the checklist works every time. But human biology isn't a factory-made jet. It is infinitely variable, you know?
Of course it's variable, but
A rash in an infant could be eczema or it could be a systemic autoimmune failure. A flowchart cannot see the difference. The sources document a horrifying example of this. A patient presented with a rash and a nurse, relying entirely on a pre-printed assessment protocol, misdiagnosed it as eczema.
right.
The flowchart dictated that itchy rashes get topical steroids. Because the initial diagnosis was fundamentally wrong, the steroid treatment suppressed the local immune system and proved disastrous. The algorithm completely blinded the practitioner to the patient's actual physiology.
Which is a tragic error. Absolutely.
It is. If an institution replaces a structural engineer with an electrician who relies purely on a manual, the lights might turn on initially, but eventually the building collapses. When you force doctors to defer to algorithms, the hospital isn't streamlining care. They're flying blind to protect their budget.
That analogy works emotionally, I'll give you that. But logically, it ignores that the electricians, in this scenario, the nurses and physician associates, are highly trained for specific bandwidths of care. The algorithms are their safety boundaries.
Boundaries they were clearly overstepping in this clinic.
Yes, a misdiagnosis of a rash is a clinical error. But let's be honest, specialist doctors misdiagnose rashes too. Human error exists at every level. The solution isn't to abolish standardized care. It's to refine the referral pathways so that when a case exceeds the protocol, it gets escalated to the doctor.
Assuming the doctor hasn't been fired for trying to correct them.
Well, the institution isn't replacing the engineer. It's trying to ensure the engineer is only called in for actual structural anomalies, not for changing light bulbs.
Except when the engineer points out that the building is in fact collapsing, the institution actively silences him. And they do it by weaponizing the very investigatory systems you're defending.
Okay, let's talk about the investigation.
Let's look at the mechanics of this retaliation. When Doctor Srivatsa tried to escalate these clinical failures, the Surrey PCT literally handed his confidential complaint to the line manager. The result? The staff orchestrated unsubstantiated claims about his clinical attitude and his sexual behavior toward female patients.
Right.
These were claims brought forward by a few nurses and a locum doctor, which is a temporary substitute doctor, that were later entirely withdrawn. It was a deliberate, targeted distraction tactic to discredit the whistleblower and force him off the wards.
I do not deny the retaliatory timing. It is glaring. But again, we must separate the timeline from the statutory duty. When claims involving sexual behavior and clinical attitude are formally raised against a physician, an institution like a PCT or the GMC has absolutely no choice but to investigate aggressively.
Even when they know it's a counterattack?
To do otherwise would be a gross dereliction of duty to vulnerable patients. Good medical practice is explicit about protecting patients from abuse of professional position. Due process must be followed. The investigation must run its course, and the claims must be vetted, even if the origin of those claims is highly suspicious. You cannot have a regulatory body ignore sexual misconduct allegations just because the accused doctor recently filed a safety report.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are ignoring how easily this system is exploited. If the system allows staff who have been accused of clinical incompetence to instantly trigger a devastating year-long disciplinary inquiry against their accuser, hasn't the whistleblowing policy just become a loaded gun handed to the very people breaking the rules?
It's a risk, certainly.
They knew an allegation of sexual misbehavior would instantly trigger an administrative freeze. They used the PCT's compliance mechanisms as a shield for their own malpractice. And the PCT allowed it? They advised him to go off sick, referred him to a psychiatrist, and dragged the investigation out for a year while the unsafe clinic continued operating.
That administrative failure is awful.
And we have to talk about who this happens to. For foreign qualified doctors like Doctor Srivatsa, current regulatory processes are uniquely precarious. They often lack the entrenched, decades-old local networks that native graduates rely on for institutional cover. This makes them significantly more vulnerable to coordinated management strikes. They are simply easier to isolate.
It is a vulnerability in the system. I absolutely concede that. Malicious actors can abuse the complaint process, and those without robust local networks, like foreign qualified doctors, suffer the isolation more acutely. But the alternative, giving whistleblowers blanket immunity from countercomplaints, would create a terrifying loophole.
I'm not saying blanket immunity, but some level of critical vetting.
But think about it. A genuinely abusive doctor could shield themselves from investigation simply by filing a preemptive complaint against the nursing staff. The system investigates everything to protect the patient, which is the ultimate goal. The rules must be universally applied, regardless of the doctor's background or the timing of the complaint.
But who is actually conducting these investigations? This brings us to a massive structural flaw Dr. Srivatsa pointed out regarding the use of lay people and generalists in regulatory assessments.
Okay, the tribunals.
Exactly. In recorded conversations regarding his fitness to practice, he explicitly challenged the GMC for using outside lay people and general practitioners to evaluate his records. He was a hospital clinician with 40 years of critical care experience. He literally said, "You can't ask a plumber to talk about your profession."
That's quite a quote.
It is. He argued that having a layperson review complex medical decisions guarantees factual errors and creates a kangaroo court.
Well, I strongly disagree with his assessment there. Integrating laypeople and generalists into regulatory tribunals is a crucial feature of modern medical oversight, not a bug. Historically, when medical boards were made up exclusively of senior specialists, we saw massive regulatory capture.
You mean doctors protecting doctors?
Exactly. It became an insular echo chamber, the old boys club looking the other way when a colleague made a mistake. Bringing in lay people and general practitioners provides a necessary objective public lens on medical conduct. It grounds the profession in public accountability. It ensures that the standards being enforced are not just technical, but represent the expectations of society.
I see why you think that prevents an echo chamber, but let me ask you this. How can a layperson objectively assess if a neurosurgical or critical care decision deviated from the standard of care when they don't possess the foundational knowledge to understand the context of that decision?
Because they aren't assessing the technical surgical maneuvers.
But they are. You are asking someone who doesn't understand the physiology of a split-second trauma intervention to judge the competence of that intervention. The investigations in the source material allege that the GMC frequently uses doctors from entirely different specialties or retired doctors who haven't practiced in decades to pass judgment. That isn't objective oversight, that is structural incompetence masquerading as accountability.
You are conflating technical peer review with fitness to practice tribunals.
Am I?
Yes. The lay people on these panels are not there to debate the cellular mechanics of a drug interaction. They are there to assess probity, honesty, adherence to core ethical guidelines, and whether a doctor's overall behavior maintains public trust in the profession. Good medical practice explicitly states that patients must be able to trust doctors with their lives. Lay members represent those patients. When assessing if a doctor was communicative, respectful, and appropriately sought consent, a plumber is perfectly qualified to pass judgment because a plumber is the patient.
But in this case, they weren't just assessing his bedside manner, were they? They were restricting his ability to practice medicine based on an institutional cover-up of clinical errors. And, this is where the comparison between medical and legal whistleblowers becomes so stark.
How so?
Well, in the legal profession, or in corporate finance, if you blow the whistle on your employer, there are robust mechanisms, actual legal standards for conflict of interest to shield you from immediate retaliation by that entity. But in medicine, the institution simply uses the medical licensing board as the weapon to suspend you.
That's a strong claim.
Let's look at the chilling effect this has on the next generation of doctors by examining the aftermath of the GMC's Interim Orders Panel, the IOP. The IOP is the panel that decides if a doctor's practice needs to be immediately restricted while an investigation happens. In February 2013, the GMC finally lifted the IOP. They cleared Doctor Srivatsa. They found no evidence his practice was a threat. Yet, what happened next?
There was a severe administrative failure.
A failure that completely ruined his life. The GMC failed to remove the IOP restriction notice from their public website. Employers looked him up, saw the restriction, and refused to hire him. This so-called administrative error rendered him entirely unemployable.
It's tragic. It really is.
It bankrupted him. He ended up living alone in a room in Germany with no money, his family life destroyed, suffering from post-traumatic stress. He had to battle the Secretary of State just to try and survive. If you were a 25-year-old medical student entering the UK workforce today, watching this happen, the message is unmistakable. Keeping your mouth shut is the only way to survive. The system will not protect you. It will isolate you, bankrupt you, and discard you.
The human toll on Dr. Srivatsa is a profound tragedy. I will not diminish the agony of what he endured due to those administrative failures. But we cannot allow the tragedy of his specific outcome to rewrite the foundational ethics of medicine.
Even when the ethics are used against the doctors.
The World Medical Association and the GMC's Good Medical Practice Manual are crystal clear. Reporting unsafe colleagues is not an optional heroic act. It is an absolute non-negotiable duty. If you see a nurse misdiagnosing a rash or a systemic failure risking superbug transmission, you must report it. Ethical obligations do not disappear just because the regulatory system is deeply flawed or administratively clumsy.
Or because you lack a local network to protect you.
Exactly. If medical students abandon the duty to whistleblow out of fear, the system collapses entirely and patients die. The moral injury of staying silent while patients are harmed is far worse than the professional risk of speaking up.
It is very easy to say that the moral injury is worse when you aren't the one being bankrupted by the state. I am not convinced that you can ask a junior doctor to throw themselves on a grenade when the system has specifically designed that grenade to destroy them and protect the hospital's budget.
That's quite a bleak view.
Well, to summarize my position in light of our discussion, the documented retaliation against Dr. Srivatsa violently exposes a regulatory system that crushes individual doctors to protect institutional reputation and finances. When a doctor exposes the dangers of replacing medical expertise with algorithms and untrained staff, institutions weaponize their own investigative protocols, breaching confidentiality, entertaining fabricated claims, and utilizing scientifically unqualified tribunals to eliminate the threat.
And to summarize my perspective, while administrative failures and local management corruption can exact a horrific human toll, the overarching frameworks remain essential. Standardized care and protocols are mathematically necessary to scale safe medicine. Objective, lay-inclusive regulatory oversight is necessary to prevent insular medical cover-ups. Furthermore, The ethical mandate for medical students to report unsafe care remains an absolute cornerstone of public protection, regardless of the personal risk. We cannot abandon systemic accountability just because its application is sometimes tragically flawed.
Well, we do find convergence on the fact that Dr. Srivatsa's specific ordeal highlights severe, undeniable flaws in how whistleblowers are handled by the NHS and the GMC. And we certainly agree that medical students entering the UK workforce face a highly complex, fraught environment.
Absolutely.
They are caught in a vice between the pristine mandates written in their textbooks and the brutal realities of institutional self-preservation on the wards.
Yeah, the gap between the ideal of good medical practice and the reality of surviving within a massive, financially strained healthcare bureaucracy is, well, it's one of the most profound challenges a new doctor will navigate.
It leaves us with a lingering question for those future physicians. If the very institutions designed to protect patient safety are the ones actively compromising that safety to maintain their own efficiency, how do you balance the duty to the patient sitting in front of you with the survival of your own career? The source material offers much more to explore regarding regulatory capture, systemic bias, and patient protection. We leave it to you to determine whether the current assembly line can be trusted to protect the truth or if pulling that red cord is simply opening the trapdoor beneath your own feet.